Imagine a battlefield where speed mattered more than armor, where innovation often lagged behind necessity, and where the machines meant to dominate were smaller, lighter, and unlike anything the Allies had ever faced. This is a story of Japan's tanks machines that were rarely in the spotlight but tell a fascinating tale of strategy, struggle, and survival. Japan's tank history begins in the shadows of the 1920s, a time when the world was experimenting with armored warfare. Unlike Germany or Britain, Japan faced unique geographical and industrial limitations, dense forests, mountainous terrain, and an overwhelming focus on naval power meant that heavy, cumbersome tanks were impracticable. Instead, Japanese engineers emphasized light tanks and mobility, a philosophy that would define their entire armored doctrine. The first real step into this new era was the Type 87 Chi, developed in the late 1920s. Though it never reached mass production, it was Japan's first serious attempt to build a tank. The Chi was slow, clunky, and its armor could barely resist rifle fire. It was more of a learning experience than a battlefield weapon, but it laid the crucial foundation for the tanks that would follow. It was a clear signal that Japan was entering the armored age, even if it was a few steps behind its Western counterparts. By the 1930s, Japan's tank designs were evolving. The Type 89 Igo, a medium tank, became the backbone of Japanese armored forces in the early years of the Second Sino-Japanese War. It was armed with a short-barreled 57mm gun, perfect for destroying machine gun nests and fortifications. In China, against poorly equipped opponents, the Type 89 was a formidable workhorse. It emphasized reliability over raw power, a practical choice for a nation fighting a long drawn-out campaign far from its industrial centers. However, its thin armor and slow speed made it vulnerable against more modern tanks, a weakness that would become painfully apparent later on. As the 1930s drew to a close, Japan's military doctrine shifted towards speed and rapid attacks. This led to the creation of one of the most iconic Japanese tanks of World War II, the Type 95 Heigo. This light tank was a marvel of mobility. Weighing only 7 tons and armed with a 37mm gun, the Heigo was perfectly suited for the jungles of the Pacific. It could navigate narrow trails and cross weak bridges where heavier Allied tanks like the Sherman couldn't dream of going. Its agility gave Japanese forces a significant advantage in the early stages of the Pacific War. However, the Heigo's strengths were also its greatest weaknesses. Its armor was incredibly thin, earning it the grim nickname Tin Can from Allied soldiers. It was vulnerable to virtually every Allied anti-tank weapon, from bazookas to 50 caliber machine guns. Despite this, the Heigo was produced in vast numbers and became a symbol of Japan's unique armored approach. Mobility first, survivability second. It was a tank designed for a specific environment, and outside of that environment, it was tragically outmatched. Alongside the Heigo, another key player emerged, the Type 97 Chiha medium tank. Introduced in the late 1930s, the Chiha became Japan's most produced medium tank of the war. Initially, it was armed with the same low-velocity 57mm gun as the older Type 89, which was effective against infantry but useless against enemy armor. Realizing this flaw, the Japanese later upgraded it with a new turret and a high-velocity 47mm gun. This improved version, the Shinhoto Chiha, was a much more balanced machine. It combined decent mobility with enough firepower to pose a threat to early war Allied tanks. However, by the time it saw widespread service, it was facing off against American Shermans and Soviet T-34s. Against these armored giants, the Chiha was still severely undergunned and underarmored, a constant theme in Japan's tank story. But Japan's ingenuity wasn't limited to land. Facing a war fought across countless islands, they pioneered the development of amphibious tanks. The Type Takami was a brilliant piece of engineering. It was a light tank designed to support island assaults. On land, it functioned like a typical tank, but with large, detachable pontoons attached to the front and rear. It could float and propel itself across water. This gave Japanese forces incredible tactical flexibility, allowing them to land tanks directly on beaches without needing a port. While innovative, these amphibious tanks arrived too late in the war to significantly alter Japan's strategic position. They were a case of the right idea at the wrong time. So, where were the heavy tanks? Unlike Germany with its Tigers and Panthers, heavy tanks were largely absent from Japan's arsenal. Prototypes like the Type 95 heavy tank were built in the 1930s, but they were slow, expensive, and deemed impractical. Later in the war, designs like the Type for Cheeto attempted to create a more formidable machine. Armed with a powerful 75mm gun, the Cheeto could have potentially challenged Allied medium tanks on equal terms. But by then, Japan's industrial capacity was crippled by Allied bombing campaigns. Only a handful of prototypes were ever completed, making them a footnote rather than a real threat. The final years of the war saw Japan engaged in desperate experimentation. As the prospect of an Allied invasion of the home islands loomed, engineers frantically designed supertanks to counter the expected onslaught. Prototypes like the Type 5 Cherry medium tank, with its 75mm autoloading cannon, were ambitious, but the most legendary of these projects was the OI Super Heavy tank. This was a monstrous 120-ton land battleship, designed to be a mobile fortress with multiple turrets. On paper, it was an engineering marvel. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare that never saw combat. By this stage, Japan simply didn't have the resources or the time to build such behemoths. These what-if tanks remain one of the most fascinating aspects of Japan's armored history. In retrospect, Japanese tanks were a direct reflection of necessity, geography, and national strategy. They were never meant to be the most powerful machines on the battlefield. Instead, they were clever, lightweight, and mobile vehicles designed for the unique terrains of Asia and the Pacific. Tanks like the Hago and Cheha were formidable in their intended roles, but they quickly became obsolete when pitted against the industrial might of the United States and the Soviet Union. Their story is one of ingenuity, struggling against overwhelming limitations. For us today, Japanese tanks are fascinating not because they dominated, but because they were so different. They teach us that in warfare, success isn't just about having the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It's about adapting to your environment and making the most of what you have. Next time you think of World War II tanks, don't just picture the rolling plains of Europe. Remember the dense jungles and remote islands of the Pacific. And if you enjoyed this journey, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into military history.